Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm Kayla McGowan, Editor-in-Chief, and today we're joined by KnowHow CEO Leighton Heeley. Welcome, Leighton.
Welcome. Well, it's good to be here, and we're here at the Experience in Punta Gorda.
Yeah.
It's a nice place.
It's beautiful, right? We got lucky with the weather, I think, a little bit. It rained a little bit yesterday, but today it's been actually really phenomenal. It's a nice cool breeze walking over, and we've had some great sessions. You got to introduce our keynote and meet a new industry professional that you can connect with, right?
Yeah, Dr. Gavin. He was brilliant. Yeah, he's like a brilliant gentleman. Yeah, solving important problems. And I would say something that we both hold near and dear is how do you bring consistency across entire industries. So looking forward to following up with him.
Yeah, I'm talking about consistencies, right? You guys play a pivotal role in helping your customers in our industry remain consistent with their processes and procedures. So culture is a huge thing, but consistency feeds into culture, right? And it requires the teams to establish their own internal standards for their business. So what are some of the barriers to achieve shared standards, and how can a business not only overcome storm season, but maybe some other situations they see on a regular basis?
So I think every business has a challenge of, we have a group of people, we advertise a shared service to the market, and then how do we make sure that we can maintain a culture of, some people might say a culture of compliance. I would say kind of a culture of shared standards and a culture ultimately of a consistency. And I think that we all draw examples from sometimes the food industry, like say McDonald's is a common example where I think that we're accustomed to having a similar experience product. And I think that, we all recognize that that's the optimal path to build a scalable business is how can we clarify and how can we standardize our services? The challenge is how do you do that in practice? So I would say just broad strokes. One of the things that first has to be overcome is that a company of any size has what we would refer to as like the knowledge keepers. So there's individuals in your organization, my organization, that have just either by tenure, like how long they've been in the company, or just by experience, they have amassed a lot of the how-to that the company runs on. And so the challenge is number one, if we're going to establish a standard, oftentimes the way we do things is in the minds of oftentimes our busiest people. And so you have this kind of challenging paradox where our busiest people have acquired the most knowledge and we need them to be contributing productively. But at the same time, those are the individuals that we rely on to be able to train, to be able to, I would say, to commit something to some type of documentation. So when you want to create a culture where you operate on a shared standard, and if you're trying to get things organized in time for storm season, you first have to get your knowledge keepers on board. And so that's a factor of two things. One is would be their level of willingness. And so if they have high willingness, then it's really a matter of, well, how do you pick a format that they can commit their knowledge to? Because nothing's more frustrating for kind of a knowledge bearer than committing their knowledge to some type of company resource, and then it just gets shelved. And so it's very frustrating. If they're unwilling, oftentimes what that's associated with is someone who has tied their career security with their ability to be the keeper of the knowledge.
Yeah.
Or they've really become accustomed to introducing themselves as, say, someone who always picks up their phone or is always available or call me on the weekend. And so some of that requires us to essentially just assure that person that their knowledge is an important component of who they are, but that actually they bring so much more than that to the table.
Yeah.
And so then how do we, in a sense, kind of move them from this mindset that your value is a frequently asked question machine to I need to move you to be like more of like a sports coach on my team.
And that's how you build additional key players to keep the longevity of your company going, right? I think oftentimes that kind of is not in somebody else's mind, especially if it's your hardest working employee, right?
Yep.
And sometimes it's about giving them that time, right? So this leads me to my next question. Oftentimes we get caught up in the shuffle, right? And like you said, things stay in our brain. And then do you have time to train while I'm in the field? And, everybody's trying to go multiple angles. If we could, duplicate ourselves, I think we'd be in a perfect world in some instances. So how can a company reset its culture and reset expectations for sharing the standards, right? Because we have industry standards, but every single company has their own set of standards that they abide by, right? So how do we reset and reshift and move forward?
So if you want to get to a place where let's say you watch our conversation, they say, Kayla, Leighton, you inspired me, right? Like, I'm doing it. We're gonna try to introduce an expectation of shared standards. I'll just give you some best practices. So one of the first ones is that previously mentioned, like that aforementioned group of knowledge experts. You have to get them on board. You have to move them from this kind of protectionist approach to keeping the knowledge to being a champion for consistency. And a lot of that is just a mental shift away from, and I would say narrowing in on a common pain point that your knowledge experts have on your team, which is, as much as they love sometimes, I would say, harboring their knowledge, as much as they love kind of harboring their knowledge, really what they would like more is they'd like more time to actually advance their projects, their initiatives, their whatever it is that they're working to advance. And so being able to help them understand that actually finding a way to equip the team with some version of the core knowledge that their team needs is the door through which that they access enormous amount more time for them to work on more meaningful projects. So you have to get these knowledge experts on board. The second thing is that before you took a run at this engagement of, like, we want to create a shared standard for our team, I like to refer to it as knowledge roots. Like, there were roots in which your, like, questions currently do get answered in your company. They're just answered in an inconsistent or an unscalable way. And so it's really about just putting it to your staff in a very, find a safe way of wording a question that's not going to make them think they're going to get in trouble, and just ask, when you have questions on the job site, how do you get them solved? Right? How do you get your questions solved? Because there are, in fact, I live in a part of the world where you have a lot of wildlife. And when you zoom up, you can see the paths that the wildlife follow. And these are routes that they're accustomed to. It's the path of least resistance. And the same thing happens with questions in our companies. So sometimes it's a text message, sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's an email. But at the end of the day, I would say, rather than replacing two behaviors at once, behavior one is, I don't know, so I should ask someone. And behavior two is, this is how I ask that someone. It's, well, how do we capture the company's knowledge in a shareable format? And then when that knowledge request comes in, via text message, via whatever, then respond with a more scalable knowledge resource that then they can refer to the next time that question comes up. And we can talk more about that. I would also say you have to introduce accountability.
Yeah.
So, we could draw from the old adage, which is, if a tree drops in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, like, did it actually make a noise? Similarly, if the company says we value consistency and compliance and doing work according to standards, but there's no accountability to the how or the outcome, is there really any, I would say, incentive to do things the right way? So you have to introduce accountability to not only the outcome, meaning, were things done the right way, but did we get there the right way?
Yeah.
And that's trickier. And there's things we can do to that. And then the last thing I would say is that then you have to introduce, recognition, advancement, and compensation to really favor staff that move towards behavior that drives forward a shared standard.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of layers to that, but those are some of the, what I would call, like, those are some of the building blocks of a culture that moves initially from kind of the Wild West, to a culture that actually recognizes that there is value in being, in a sense, almost governed by a shared playbook, is a language we would see.
Exactly. And I think the word is essential, right? You're like that essential person to put everything in place. And speaking of all of this, KnowHow actually helps with all of this. Can you dive into that just a little bit? I know we can take one scenario, but actually, even if it's in CAT or if it's in just a water loss, you can actually streamline it within your company, right? Make changes. And how does that all work with KnowHow?
So if you're going to establish a playbook for your company, I think the questions that you have to overcome, it's not just simply, is there value in creating a standard or creating a process or creating a step-by-step procedure? The questions is, where will it live? What's the format that's going to be the easiest for, let's call it, young tech native staff to interact with? What if it changes? What if English is not the language that they prefer to work in? And then there's a whole host of other questions like how do we know whether or not things were done the right way when we weren't there? So KnowHow we're the leader in the technology side of that. And so I think probably what I would offer up is the most natural way to transfer knowledge, in my experience, is shoulder to shoulder. The ability for you to just show up on site and say, "Hey, everyone, pay attention. This is how we do this." Well, KnowHow as a leader in AI, one of the ways that our customers use KnowHow to capture their tribal knowledge, their undocumented knowledge, is they just ask that young person to say, and just point the company's KnowHow app at me as I'm explaining this, and then just through the power of visual capture AI, as they're explaining how to do those flood cuts, how to properly secure that that component, or how to properly apply that chemical or mix that product, KnowHow is actually building and editing the SOPs and the processes in real time. So we have a variety of features that do that and more. But simply put, like, we live in a day now where if you can just demonstrate it once, the documentation, the video editing, the writing of the processes, all of that is done by technology. And so gone are the days where you'd say, well, I could never convince my top person to sit down in front of a Word document and write it all out. And if I did, and then it just lived on a shelf somewhere in some digital folder, they would be so frustrated with me. Those days are over. Yeah, those days are over. And I would say that if I was preparing for cat season or the next frozen pipe season or whatever the season that's coming, if you can actually just say, hey, when we go out and we just do it once, let's use technology to capture it, and then instantaneously we're going to be able to put that in everyone's hands. Drives an enormous amount of, I would say, risk avoidance. But brass tacks, it's a great way to save money, make money, avoid a lot of risk.
Well, it makes your training a lot easier too. It's not just to have every job run the same way or your processes be the same. We all know that time is what is not really on our side in any industry that is a service, right? And I think that's the most important thing is, we need people to come in and help, but training oftentimes is, oh, I have to take my best person out of the field and put them into our classroom or our training center, which you can still have that opportunity, but it's actually instant gratification, right? You can take your time. I think that's the other thing that I really love about KnowHow is everybody digests information at a different speed. They have questions in different areas, and with the videos and the step-by-steps, it allows them to actually have additional questions if they have them. And if not, it just helps them feel more comfortable when they do get into the field.
Yeah, I think that if we were to say what would be the optimal solution, the optimal solution would be that everybody would be paired with a mentor who has 25 to 30 years of relevant experience, and they'd be able to just very patiently receive what we call like just plain language questions. For the life of me, I cannot remember, once I lay down this, what do you call this stuff again? Once I lay that down and then I install the top layer, what do I do to stick it together? So that's plain language questions, and that's how you would normally word it to someone who has more experience. And they'd say, okay, well, what you're describing is 2 poly layers. What you're describing is what's called a vapor barrier, and what you're describing is what's called tuck tape. Oh yeah. And to someone with experience, it's just like
second
nature. But a person asks a very fumbled, plain language question, and I think that's where solutions like KnowHow come to the table. In that, we really are the leader in what we call just that contextual plain language search. So a worker in any language can just ask the company's knowledge environment or KnowHow a plain language question, like I just asked, like I just kind of role modeled, and immediately the KnowHow has the ability to understand broadly across all the company's knowledge and provide them a very simplified answer in the language they prefer to work in, and then to be able to connect them to the whole sea of resources that they may not have even been aware of. And it makes them feel supported, it makes them feel empowered, and frankly, it makes them feel motivated to be an extension of that standard. What a time to be alive.
I know, honestly, technology is such a great aid for us. It helps us enhance our processes, our procedures, and I also think it also enhances culture, right? Because sometimes I think we've all been there. We're the new person and we're like, we do want to ask these questions, but do we ask them the right way? Does it make us seem like we don't know what we're doing? Yeah. And everybody's faced that, right? But this is the opportunity to sit down, learn your company's processes and procedures, and feel comfortable with asking the questions. And even to your, role play that you just did, even if you're describing it and using hand motions, because you already know the material, but you're just in that moment, you're like, I can't remember the name of the material, the name of the product. And that's where you're able to cut down time, but also get the answer you're looking for.
And cut down errors. I think that the science of memory is that there are parts of our mind that are responsible for long-term recall. And those parts of our mind work best when we are at ease, we're rested, we're not stressed. That doesn't sound like this industry.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So at the end of the day, there are even frankly, there are even biological things working against us to make it difficult for us to recall things. So we know that we as people, we don't memorize phone numbers anymore, don't memorize directions anymore, and even more so, we're in a very fight or flight, very stressful industry. And so there's a lot working against us to make it easy to recall things. And so that's why I think, technology, the right technology has the opportunity to be such a tremendous aid to those workers. And we know from our research that the number one reason why technicians don't stick around is that within the first 30 to 60 days, they just had too many days where they felt unsupported, unguided, getting mixed messages, and ultimately they feel kind of like a dummy. And we would say, well, that's what I had to go through.
Yeah.
But the problem is that in their personal lives, they have a constant experience of knowledge empowerment.
Yeah.
And so when I feel empowered to make that sourdough bread, to easily do something on my vehicle with a quick search on my phone, and I feel empowered and I feel like I can tackle any problem in my personal life, but then I come into my work environment and I just feel like I'm just working in molasses.
Or asking the same question all the time, right?
Question. Yeah, or they ask the same question and they get different answers based on who their project manager is that day. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I understand why that happens, but it's just very frustrating for a worker. So what I think is very powerful is I think companies make a mistake where they try to say, we're gonna enforce a culture of compliance. Compliance is the birthday party that no one shows up to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like that's the person who had a veggie tray and they say, you know what, we're going to skip on the cake this year, right?
Yeah.
And so what we would say is that actually what cultures really get on board with is a culture of optimization. And so one of the powerful things that we're focused on in KnowHow is absolutely we should lay down the groundwork of the company's best way of doing it. But then very easily for staff, if they have suggestions that, things that might save a trip to the shop, get the van packed up properly, but more efficiently, perhaps provide a better customer experience, just the ability to, on that company's standards, to click a button and make a suggestion. Yeah. Not make an edit, but make a suggestion. And then for the knowledge keepers to be able to say, okay, well, they don't know the context as to why we don't do it that way. Yeah. I'm going to get some time with her and just help her to understand the why. Or, that's a pretty good suggestion. And then approved. And then for me to go from this is what I have to do to, wow, I am actually contributing to the company's best practices. I've never contributed to anything significant in my life, they might say, right? And
or a place of work.
Or a place of work,
right?
Yeah. That's probably a better way to phrase it. Is that I haven't left my thumbprint on a work environment, and that feels pretty good.
Yeah.
It feels pretty empowering. So to move your staff and say, hey, everyone, we're going to tie our shoes extra tight and we're going to just follow, we're going to walk these lines. That's not anyone's idea of a fun environment.
Fun time, yeah.
But to sit down with the team and say, hey, everyone, we're going to start to move from kind of the Wild West to kind of run more like a sports team. And we're going to begin to run plays where we all have routes. And after we run these routes a few times, if you want to come up to me, the owner, or kind of, or whatever your respective kind of coach analogy would be. Yeah. And if you have a suggestion of how we can maybe tighten up that pattern, deliver that service in a way where we come out more profitable with a happier customer, following the industry standards, I'm interested.
Yeah.
And that can be very empowering for staff. But like I said, it starts with being able to get the knowledge keepers on board. assuring them that, frankly, their jobs are secure, and we just want to move them onto more meaningful work. It, I think, helps if you have a tool in the mix. I would recommend KnowHow, a tool that makes it very easy for you to capture, distribute, modify, translate, augment your knowledge.
It's customizable too, right? I think that's the thing is you list all of these great things, but I think one of the key things to me is customization.
Customization is a big thing. One of the things I find is that if you ask someone to say, on this blank sheet of paper, just write down how you do what you do. It's it's writer's block.
I was gonna say just nothing. Everything leaves your brain.
You're
right?
right. You're a writer.
Everything leaves your brain.
You're a writer, right? I mean, you know what writer's block's all about. I'd love to see what your Spotify playlists are.
I don't know if you want to know. It's all over the place because some things, and depending on how your day's going, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing is when someone's in the field, they know exactly what they're doing on. But then to articulate it into words on paper, it feels permanent, right? Yeah. And sometimes it's like, I am contributing, but how do I say this so everybody can interpret it too, right? That's hard.
Well, what we do at KnowHow is there's a whole bunch of things that we do to make it very easy. One is, we have the largest how-to library in the industry that's available to our customers at no cost. Yeah. To just be able to say, oh, there's a template, there's an example of how someone does a pack out, does a Cat 3 response, takes care of a frozen, so I'm just going to take that and I'm just going to make it my own. I'm going to mark it up, but I find for especially people that have the experience that sometimes have never had to articulate step by step how you do what you do, what I find is that it's very easy. It's easier for them to look at something and say what's wrong with it and tweak it than it is to look at just a blinking cursor being like, oh, shoot, how do what I do? And then they look at their phone and they're like, I'll call this guy back instead, right? Yeah. There's always something they'd rather do.
Yeah, exactly.
So we provide a lot of that, but then also we have a lot of generative solutions. Generative is a term in AI where the AI does the heavy lifting. So an example would be you can just ask our AI, we say hey, just give me a process for how to erect scaffolding on a commercial building, and it'll just instantly write it. And a person experienced will say, well, that's probably more like the way they do in the state of Mississippi, but over here in California, and you make it your own.
Yeah. It gives you the structure, right? It gives you the structure. Yeah. And I think that's the cool thing is even if you have processes and procedure on paper, but maybe things have changed and it's not the structure that you use, and then you end up with arrows and cross out, and you can actually put that in.
Just talk to it. Like that's I think especially with some of our clients that have diligently worked over the years to create quality training videos, great documents. They've amassed documents from their materials providers, their suppliers, industry events, conferences like the Experience, right? How do we take all this knowledge and not have to do a bunch of double work? You just dump it into KnowHow. And then KnowHow converts it all into a consistent format that your staff are familiar with. And it does that heavy lifting. And then we're pretty excited about some functionality that we brought out this year, which is simply the ability, either when I'm typing on my keyboard doing an exactimate estimate or I'm doing something in the field, if you can just click a button or just have someone just point the company's app at me, it builds the SOP in real time.
That's so cool.
And that ability, I think that idea of, we like to say, if you can just do it once, all the documentation is done.
Yeah.
Pretty excited about that. And the reaction from our customers who we serve, it's been very exciting to see how we've been able to really transform this old pain point.
Yeah, and it's just evolution, right? I think that's the other thing is technology, like KnowHow, is at the forefront of our evolution for this industry. And I think, we've seen this year started off really chaotic with the fires. We've had flooding, we've had tornadoes. There's just no true season anymore, I guess. And what better way to help prepare yourself, not only for the emergency situations, but everyday jobs. And not all jobs are the same. Obviously, no one job is the same. But it allows you to tweak and manipulate what you guys need to do in the field. And I think that's extremely important. So I think we could talk probably for hours about this, honestly, but I'd really like to thank you for taking time here at the Experience with me. And I'll see you again in a couple weeks and maybe we can do it again. But thank you, everybody. And as always, take care.